The internet did not invent fear, but it changed how fear spreads. For most of human history, monsters came from stories passed down over generations. They lived in forests, ruins, caves, and the dark spaces beyond civilization. They changed slowly, shaped by culture, religion, and geography. But the internet compresses time. Ideas that once took centuries to evolve now take weeks. Stories that once belonged to a single culture now spread globally overnight. In this environment, a new kind of monster emerged. Not ancient, not supernatural, but deeply human. This is the story of Slender Man, not just as a fictional character, but as a case study in how belief, fear, and collaboration can turn imagination into something that feels real. At first glance, Slender Man appears deceptively simple. He is tall, far taller than any normal human. His body is unnaturally thin, stretched almost beyond anatomical possibility. His limbs are long and narrow, often depicted bending or extending in ways that feel subtly wrong, as if his bones don't follow human rules. He wears a black suit, a white shirt, and a tie. This detail matters more than it seems. Unlike most horror monsters, Slender Man is not dressed like a creature. He does not wear rags, claws, armor, or anything that suggests violence or savagery. Instead, he wears clothing associated with professionalism, adulthood, authority, and control. A suit is something you trust, something you obey, something that belongs in offices, schools, courtrooms, and institutions. Slender Man does not look wild, he looks official. But his most disturbing feature is what he lacks. Slender Man has no face, no eyes to meet your gaze, no mouth to speak, no expression to interpret. We, humans, are biologically wired to read faces. From infancy, we rely on facial cues to determine intent, emotion, and safety. Faces tell us whether something is alive, hostile, friendly, afraid, or neutral. But when a face is missing, the brain struggles to categorize what it is seeing. This creates a form of cognitive discomfort. Your mind searches for meaning and finds none, and that absence becomes terrifying. In most depictions, Slender Man is not shown attacking. He is not mid-motion, lunging or striking. Instead, he stands still, often partially obscured by trees, fog, walls, or the edges of photographs. He exists in the background, not the foreground. He is something you notice only after you've already been looking at the image for too long. This is a deliberate inversion of traditional horror. Slender Man does not announce himself, he waits to be noticed. And in many stories, once you notice him, something irreversible has already begun. Fictional accounts often describe victims experiencing subtle symptoms long before any direct encounter. These include headaches, paranoia, memory loss, nosebleeds, and a sense of being watched even when alone. Technology begins to malfunction, audio distorts, visual static appears, photographs become corrupted. The implication is not that Slender Man is physically violent, but that his presence destabilizes reality itself, or at least the victim's perception of it. Importantly, Slender Man does not behave like a predator in the traditional sense. He does not chase loudly or aggressively, he does not roar, he does not explain his intentions. Instead, he appears closer each time he is seen. Distance loses meaning. This taps into a deeply unsettling idea that awareness itself is dangerous, that simply noticing something can invite it closer. In this way, Slender Man functions less like a monster and more like a phenomenon. He is not something that attacks you, he is something that happens to you. Another crucial element of Slender Man's design ambiguity, there is no definitive explanation for what he is. Some stories suggest he is an ancient entity, others imply he is a thought form, a physical parasite, or a manifestation of fear itself. In many cases, no explanation is offered at all. This lack of canon is not a weakness, it is the core of his effectiveness. By refusing to define Slender Man, the myth allows the audience's imagination to do the work. Each viewer fills in the blanks differently, based on their own fears. For some, he represents loss of control, for others, surveillance, for others, childhood vulnerability or institutional authority. Slender Man becomes a mirror, what you fear most is what he becomes. And this is why the character resonated so strongly online. He was not bound to a single narrative or interpretation. He could exist simultaneously as a monster, a symbol, a psychological threat, or a background anomaly. He did not demand belief, he invented curiosity. And curiosity is often the first step towards fear. By design, Slender Man is never fully present. He exists at the edge of perception, in the corner of a photograph, at the end of a forest path, behind a group of people who do not see him. He is always slightly removed, slightly distant, slightly unreal, and yet unmistakably there. That contradiction, being both absent and present at the same time, is what makes Slender Man more unsettling than monsters that are clearly visible and clearly hostile. You don't fear what you can see clearly, you fear what you can't stop noticing. And that is what Slender Man truly is. Over time there have been hundreds, thousands, millions of monsters. Most of them fade into history because no one remembers exactly where they came from, but Slender Man is different. He does not emerge from folklore, religion, or tradition. He appeared suddenly. Slender Man was created in June of 2009 on the Something Awful forums during a Photoshop challenge designed to produce convincing paranormal images. The rules were simple. Take an ordinary photograph and alter it just enough to make it unsettling, while presenting it as something mysterious or unexplained. There was no expectation that these images would escape this forum. They were meant to be clever, briefly unsettling, then forgotten. One user, Eric Knurston, posting under the name Victor Surge, submitted 2 edited black and white photographs. Both images depicted groups of children playing outdoors. Nothing about the scenes themselves was threatening. They looked like ordinary moments frozen in time. But in the background of each image stood a tall, shadowy figure, faceless, motionless, watching. Eric added short captions beneath the images. They were written in a matter of fact tone, as if excerpted from a report or archive. The captions suggested that the children in the photographs later disappeared, and that the images were among the last known records of them. Crucially, the captions did not scream horror, they implied it. This restraint mattered. The images were unsettling not because they were graphic or shocking, but because they felt plausible. They looked like the kind of photographs that might exist unnoticed in a forgotten archive. Something ordinary at first glance, but deeply wrong once examined closely. At no point did Eric claim the images were real, but the presentation didn't emphasize fiction either, and that ambiguity was enough. Within hours, other forum users began responding, not debunking the images, but by expanding on them. They added fictional details, references to non-existent reports, and hints of larger narrative. The tone remained restrained and documentary-like, mimicking the language of official records rather than campfire stories. Slender Man was framed from the beginning as something that hides in mundane documentation, photographs, files, reports, rather than something that announces itself. That framing gave the character credibility. Importantly, this moment marks a shift in how horror was being created online. Slender Man was not introduced as a story to be consumed, but as a mystery to be investigated. The audience was not told how to think or feel, they were being invited to look closer, search for patterns, and fill in gaps. This invitation is what transformed a fictional character into a phenomenon. Once the images left the Something Awful forums, they spread rapidly to other platforms. Each new repost stripped away a bit of the original context. The Photoshop challenge, the known fiction, the original intent, all of that became less visible. What remained were the images themselves, and images are persuasive. As the images circulated, people began encountering Slender Man without knowing where he came from. They did not see him as a fictional character with an author, they saw him as a discovered anomaly, something uncovered rather than invented. And when people believe a story was discovered, they treat it differently. From this point on, Slender Man no longer belonged to its creator, he belonged to the internet. Users began adding false histories, claiming he appeared in medieval woodcuts or early photographs. Others suggested he was an ancient entity that predated modern civilization. None of these claims were true, but the truth was no longer the point. Everything was written as if it could be real. By the time the wider internet encountered Slender Man, his origin had already been obscured by layers of collaborative storytelling. What began as 2 edited photographs had become a network of references, sightings, and implied documentation. He now had a history, and history makes things feel real. Slender Man did not spread because people actually believed he existed, he spread because the format made belief unnecessary. You didn't have to accept him as real, you only had to wonder if he might be, and that uncertainty was enough to let him grow. Months after his creation, by late 2009, Slender Man had already spread far beyond his original images, now existing in short stories and fake reports. But all of these formats shared one limitation: they were static. That changed with the arrival of Marble Hornets. Marble Hornets was a YouTube series that presented itself not as a show, but as a collection of found footage, videotapes discovered after a series of disturbing events. The story followed a college student who uploaded recordings left behind by a friend named Alex, who had abruptly abandoned a film project and cut off contact. From the beginning, the series refused to behave like traditional horror. There was no introduction, no title card explaining the premise, no clear indication that what you were watching was fictional. The videos were quiet, awkward, and often uneventful. Long stretches showed nothing more than empty rooms, shaky camera movement, or ordinary conversations. This mundane quality was intentional. It mirrored the way real life footage looks: unpolished, incomplete, and often boring. And then, occasionally, something went wrong. A figure appeared in the background, a frame glitched, a sound distorted. The entity that viewers would later associate with Slender Man was referred to only as the operator, only appearing a few frames at a time, easy to miss unless you were actively searching. Marble Hornets did not force fear onto the viewer, it required participation. Viewers slowed videos down, they analysed frames, they discussed theories in the comments section and forums. Unlike a scripted horror film, Marble Hornets never gave the audience a clear boundary between fiction and reality. Slender Man was no longer just a figure in edited photos or fictional reports, he was now something that could appear unexpectedly in everyday environments, recorded by ordinary people using consumer technology. This shifted the fear from imaginative to situational. Another crucial aspect of Marble Hornets was its refusal to provide resolution. Viewers raised questions about what they were witnessing and were left unanswered. Characters disappeared without explanation, footage ended abruptly, timelines became fragmented. This incompleteness mirrors how real-life mysteries behave. Real life doesn't offer neat conclusions, and because the story never fully resolved, it lingered. Even after the viewers stopped watching, the idea remained active in their minds. They questioned backgrounds, they noticed shadows, they wondered if something could be hiding just out of frame. Marble Hornets didn't just tell a story, it trained viewers how to look, and from then on, the influence of Marble Hornets extended far beyond its own runtime. It inspired countless other web series, alternate reality games, and analog horror projects. It established a template: minimal exposition, maximum ambiguity, and a heavy reliance on audience participation. Most importantly, it cemented Slender Man's identity as a background entity, and this concept aligned perfectly with his original design. The character was never meant to dominate the frame, he was meant to hide within it. Marble Hornets gave that idea motion, time, and persistence, and in doing so, it completed the transformation of Slender Man from an internet image into something that felt disturbingly close to reality. Not because he was believable, but because the format made disbelief irrelevant. You didn't have to believe, you only had to watch, and once you started watching close enough, you couldn't stop. While Slender Man had already established himself through images, stories, and web series, his transition into video games marked a fundamental shift in how the character was experienced. Up until this point, engagement with the myth had been observational. People read stories, analysed images, or watched footage. The fear existed at a distance. Video games removed that. An indie game titled Slender the 8 Pages began circulating online. It was not backed by a major studio, featured no voice acting, and used simple environments and mechanics. Despite this, or perhaps because of it, the game spread rapidly through YouTube and gaming communities. The premise was intentionally minimal. The player is placed alone in a dark forest at night and instructed to collect 8 scattered pages. There is no explanation for who the player is, why the pages matter, or what will happen once they are collected. The only guidance is an unspoken rule that quickly becomes apparent. Slender Man is present, and he must be avoided. There are no weapons, no tools, and no ability to defend yourself. The player's only actions are movement and observation. Traditional horror games often provide players with some form of control, even if limited. Slender the Eight Pages removes that illusion entirely. Progression is not achieved through skill or combat, but through endurance and navigation under pressure. And as pages are collected, the environment changes. Audio distortion increases, visual static begins to interfere with the screen, Slender Man appears more frequently and at closer distances. These changes are not explained through dialogue or narrative cues, they are felt through sensory disruption. The game communicates danger not through story, but through interference. This aligns closely with how Slender Man had already been portrayed in other media. The game translates those ideas into mechanics, making the player responsible for interpreting those signals in real time. And in 2013, this concept was expanded with Slender the Arrival, a commercially released title that added narrative structure, voice acting, and additional environments. While more polished, the game retained the core principles that made the original effective: limited information, vulnerability, and an emphasis on atmosphere over explanation. The Arrival explored themes already present in Slender Man's lore, such as memory loss, obsession, and psychological deterioration. It suggested that prolonged exposure to the entity had lasting effects, blurring the line between external threat and internal breakdown. However, it still avoided providing a definitive explanation for Slender Man himself. The focus remained on experience rather than resolution. What these games demonstrated was that Slender Man functioned especially well in interactive spaces. The character did not need complex backstory or explicit motivation. His effectiveness came from how he disrupted normal patterns of perception and control. By placing players in environments where observation itself became risky, the game enforced the core idea behind the myth, that some threats do not need to act in order to dominate attention. One of the most disturbing aspects of Slender Man's lore is his association with children. Historically, myths involving children spread faster and persist longer. Children represent vulnerability, innocence, and fear of loss, all powerful emotional triggers. And Slender Man's stories often portrayed children as targets, not because of violence, but because children are more susceptible to belief. However, in 2014, this became real. At this point, Slender Man had existed online for nearly 5 years, and during that time, he had appeared in stories, images, video games, and discussions across countless platforms. For most people, he remained what he had always been, a fictional character, unsettling but clearly imaginary. That perception changed abruptly in May of that year. In the city of Waukesha, two 12-year-old girls lured a classmate into a wooded area and stabbed her 19 times, and against overwhelming odds, the victim survived and was able to reach help. When the attackers were arrested, investigators struggled to understand the motive. There was no personal conflict, no argument, no clear material gain. What emerged during questioning shocked the public and dominated headlines around the world. The girls claimed they believed Slender Man was real. They said they carried out the attack to appease him and feared that failing to do so would result in harm to themselves or their families. According to their statements, the act was not driven by anger or cruelty, but by belief and fear. Almost immediately, public reaction focused on Slender Man as the cause. Media outlets questioned whether internet horror content was dangerous, parents demanded explanations, platforms scrambled to distance themselves from the character. For many observers, the narrative seemed obvious. A fictional monster had influenced real-world violence. But that explanation, while emotionally satisfying, was incomplete. Subsequent psychological evaluations revealed that both attackers suffered from severe mental illness. These conditions existed independently of Slender Man. The character did not create the illness, nor did it instruct the violence. What it provided was structure. When a person experiences delusions or distorted thinking, the mind often searches for a narrative framework to organise those experiences, and Slender Man fits unusually well. He was authoritative, threatening, undefined, and omnipresent in stories. He did not contradict delusional thinking because he had no fixed rules. He did not require proof. He could exist anywhere and demand anything. During the police investigation, one of the Slender killers, Geisa, disclosed since childhood she had experienced hallucinations. These typically included figures she interpreted as ghosts, colours melting down walls, and imaginary friends named Maggie and Sev. Her correctional officer reported seeing her having ongoing conversations with Slender Man, and before they were apprehended, the two of them told officers they were going to meet the Slender Man at his home, which they called Slender Mansion. they planned to commit the killing to appease Slender Man and prove that he was real. After hearing this story, an unidentified woman from Ohio told a TV reporter in June of 2014 that her 13-year-old daughter had attacked her with a knife and had written fiction, some involving the Slender Man, whom the mother said motivated the attack. On September 4th of 2014, a 14-year-old girl in Florida allegedly set fire to her family's house while her mother and 9-year-old brother were inside. Police reported the teenager had been reading online stories about Slender Man, and during a 2015 epidemic of young people attempting to take their life, Slender Man was cited as an influence. Because of all of this, the question was raised: who exactly was responsible for explaining the boundary between fiction and reality? The Waukesha case marked a turning point in how Slender Man was discussed. From that moment on, the character could no longer be treated solely as an internet curiosity or creative experiment. He became an example, often cited, sometimes misunderstood, of the risks associated with uncontextualized storytelling in a digital environment. But the most important lesson of the case is not that Slender Man was too convincing, or the horror should be restricted. The lesson is that stories don't exist in a vacuum. They interact with belief, mental health, environment, and interpretation. For most people, this interaction is harmless. For a very small number, it can be dangerous. Not because the story demands harm, but because it becomes entangled with something already fragile. Slender Man did not cross into the real world on his own, he was carried there by belief. Since then, over 10 years later, his mystery has almost died. But Slender Man didn't disappear because he never existed. And he didn't need to, because we proved that was never required.